Welcome to this conversation with Open-Ended Design. We speak with activists and creators from around the world about design, technology, and culture, unpacking their work, generating new ideas, and exploring their dreams for the future. I'm very happy to share this conversation with Anab Jain, an artist and futurist. I first met Anab a few years ago at the London Design Biennale. Jonathan Reiki, the director of Somerset House, had said to me, "There is one person here that you need to meet." She was standing with her students from the University of Applied Arts in Vienna in the midst of an installation they had done on the climate crisis. All of that says a lot about her. She speaks here with me about the climate crisis and how we need to learn to live with other species. Also, as a futurist, she is working on new narratives in artificial intelligence with organizations like Deepmind and Omidyar, and we talk about that. But the bits that I found the most interesting personally were hearing about her childhood in India and the myths she grew up with. As a South Asian woman, I found it really moving to hear her speak about moments of struggle and experiences of discrimination. Many of us have been there, and not all of us feel strong enough to share, so I'm grateful to her. Anab is shining a light to the future.
So I have your bio here, and then I just want to unpack a little bit because you are a designer, a futurist, a filmmaker, and an educator, and you're of course a professor. You're the co-founder and director of Superflux, one of the coolest, I guess, art design studios on earth. And when you mentioned, John, that your partner, and you have built a new kind of design practice in a world of troubling futures. I think a lot of your work is looking at how do we look forward and how do we maybe try to avoid or work around the future that we live in. And so, if I was to describe you to somebody who didn't know your work or your practice, for me, you're a philosopher of our times, and you're using design to present your ideas and to explore them and to explore new narratives. It's inspiring and powerful, but I also wonder for yourself, as somebody who's navigated this journey, how you feel about that, how much time you probably worry or don't worry about defining yourself in any number one of these spaces, and how organic that feels for you, particularly since you don't just work at Superflux.
I would say Superflux and our practice probably really is the gravitational pull for my practice, and John's practice is very much a shared practice. We both graduated from the Royal College of Art. I came from India with a very different perspective. John came from fine art, but then spent a few years doing literally like any job he could get, from packing rubber underwear for a sex shop to taking care of elderly in council homes before he joined the Royal College of Art. So we both bring very different perspectives, but I think what we kind of were interested in doing first and foremost was retaining a sense of autonomy in our practice. So we wanted to be able to dedicate a lot of our time to projects that we wanted to initiate ourselves. Therefore, we've not formed ourselves as a big kind of company which is churning out a lot of commercial projects, and that's intentional because that gives us the opportunity to think about these kinds of projects which are self-initiated. We don't need to do them. There's no kind of obligation. So I suppose that desire to explore and experiment with ideas and with sort of using our interests in design and art and film and storytelling to bring them to life is perhaps what steers us. And then, of course, underlying social mission or a sense of slow activism that dictates the work is to use our skills and our ability to be able to tell these plural stories that, when seeded, can spark imagination, can raise questions, can hopefully help in critical reflection, can kind of just be there as ways of seeing, as different ways of seeing this world that we are part of.
I just get back from the Venice Biennale this weekend. Your piece, for whoever's been to the Venice Biennale, art or architecture, it's in the main building of the Arsenale, which is massive, and there's 1 billion things in that building. And so it's quite hard to stop and to absorb the installations. But yours, I did not know which one was yours. I wasn't looking for a table. I knew you had done a piece of work there, and I saw it and I stopped. And in the midst of all of, some really interesting things, it brought this moment of pause and connection. And I think there was a really feminine energy as to how you had, and maybe there's something about the idea of the dining table, which is what the installation was, a very feminine idea of nurturing and hosting and holding together. But the story of your piece is so much deeper.
Yes, it's a bit of pet project and a sort of real effort. A lot of love and care went into that project from the whole studio. So it's really John and I developed the concept while we have been developing the idea of a more than human approach to how we see our place on the planet. This piece called Refuge for Resurgence is really inspired by that work, plus the people we read, plus a lot of walks in the woods and stuff, where we've spent quite a lot of time noticing and observing the relationship we have with other species on the planet, and really wanted to celebrate that relationship and celebrate the interdependence and interconnection which we have with all other species on the planet. And so by creating this vast kind of majestic oak table, and by inviting many different species to dine with us, so giving them all a place on the table, we really wanted to acknowledge that we are equal in many ways, and that we need to give and take. We have this shared bond of companionship, even though some of them may be predators and some of them may be considered pests. All these different species alongside humans have a seat on the table. And so that was really the project. It was like we are all seeking refuge for a resurgence where we are regenerating our collective futures. They might be generated from the waste of the Anthropocene, they might be emerging from what is left over of the times we are in today, or they could act as beacons of hope for us to navigate through the current crisis. So really it's a project that is talking to the climate crisis, but we are trying to create a sort of mythopoetic narrative that we all can sort of hold on to as we navigate this crisis. That, hey, what does it mean to have a fox and a boar and a rat and a snake and a wasp and a mushroom and a human child all dying together?
And can I ask you to describe it? Because you have this giant, like you said, this oak table, and then you've laid out place settings for all sorts of species, basically.
So really, the story is of a journey from what we are calling apocalypse to resurgence, starting with the fox and each species. So we have 14 plates on this table. Each plate in a table setting is for each species. So we have 2 human adults and a human child. And then we have a fox, a boar, wild boar, a snake, a rat, a wasp, a raven, a mushroom, a pigeon, a wolf.
Who chose the animals?
So John and I chose the animals. We were interested in acknowledging specifically species who we consider as pests or vermins today, and say that this really exemplifies the idea of human control over nature, where we as humanity have decreed certain species to be pests. They really are species who've lived for a long time in this landscape before us.
So you mentioned India and you mentioned kind of your perspective. And I think you've talked a little bit about this in the past, is kind of your experience of growing up. You didn't have fairy tales in the way that we do in the West. You had a very different set of inspirations or the stories or mythologies that you grew up with. And your work is very resonant for me, some of it, because you really do lean into magical realism and the idea of myths and imaginations. It's so whimsical, this dining table that you created. And I'm quite curious about, because, part of this is living in the West, part of this is being, in a pretty cynical world in general. For you in the world that you inhabit, to be able to bring, these really dreamy, thoughtful stories to make us think of really troubling, dark realities is this amazing kind of counterbalance. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your own experience growing up and how you've also had the confidence to translate that to a very different kind of audience.
Yeah, I grew up in Ahmedabad in Gujarat in India. And when I was young, I had to start off, fairly frugal upbringing. We had no television in the house. I had a few friends, summers would be like 45 degrees, like just bored out of our minds, not knowing what to do. And that's when you start you start entering these worlds of imagination and storytelling. So there was always a ongoing series of ghost stories. Every elder person we met had spotted a ghost around the corner of our house, and everyone had a different narrative around it. And most of the stories, now that I look back, whether it was like the big epics or the kind of hundreds of stories about various gods and goddesses, and were actually about more than human worlds. Now, if I look back on it, because there was always multitude of creatures occupying multiple layers of the planet. Under the soil, serpent kingdom. There was the flying angels and demons, and there was this churning of the ocean, and there was the mermaids, and there's all sorts of creatures. And also around us, because we lived near a field, and there were just all these cows. And there was this little village, and these women would come, and I'd go with them, because they would all kind of walk in these big, bright, colorful skirts and plonk themselves at various places on the field to pick up the cow dung from the cows, like fresh cow dung, take it home and make them into these flat pancakes and dry them, which would be the fuel for cooking. So it was such a kind of so far removed from our lives today. It was like saying, oh, you know what, I'm going to live my off the grid life. Yeah. So I think that sort of has had, now in reflections over the years, has had quite a deep impact on me, where I was absorbing everything in analog. I was absorbing different levels of fiction and storytelling and myth making. And even though our work over the last few years has perhaps lent towards what I might call speculative realism, where we've tried to take people on a journey to help them suspend disbelief, provided very recognizable touch points. So here's an apartment. Do you recognize the apartment? You know it's an apartment. But once you walk around it, things are different. So people are able to suspend disbelief.
Can you unpack that?
So, for the project Mitigation of Shock, we have created a number of different apartments, which are apartments that bring to life domestic life in a climate-altered future. So you have an apartment, say around 2050 in London. What would it be like to live in this world? And the reason we were going with domestic life and specifically thinking about food was because we wanted to make this idea of climate change very tangible. And that would be through the experience of living in a home. In those projects, they are real life-sized, fully formed apartments, extreme amounts of detail. You open a door, there's a sofa, there's a dining table, there's a kitchen. You turn around the corner, the home is completely covered with weird contraptions with purple fog coming out of them and stuff like that. First, when they enter the home and they look around, oh, this is like a house. I can recognize everything. And then when you turn around and say, hang on a second, what's going on here? That's when people start drawing connections and understanding that this is not the present, but it's a different world. So that I would label as an idea of speculative realism, that it's speculative in nature, but realism in its kind of manifestation. Whilst with the Venice project, we are aiming to bring back some of those mythic ideas that perhaps are more from my childhood.
Yeah, but there is this idea, like, what is visceral? What do we connect with? And how do you actually force a bit of a shock? And I also wonder about this as an artist or a designer, somebody who's building experiences for audiences around the world. How do you keep people engaged? How do you actually connect with them? And how much does it matter? Because you, in some ways, are basically an R&D practice, right? I mean, you spend all of this time on the back end considering what is the story that you want to tell. So how do you think about that? How do you translate that? And how do you also define that kind of line between the R&D, which is needed and necessary?
I'd say we think a lot about our visitors, and we think a lot about the experiential journey the visitor would take. So say it kind of I suppose has parallel ideas being developed at the same time. So we have a commission, or we have a, like with the Venice, it was an invitation, and so we sort of knew the location and we knew the theme, and we wanted to tie how will we live together was the question they were asking. Hashim Sarkis, the curator, was asking. At the same time, we were thinking about our multi-species banquet actually already, and it completely like answers it completely it kind of doesn't answer, not, it's not a question that's meant to be answered in that sense, but it reflects on that question. How will we live together? Will we need to live in a completely different way? And, could this be a kind of, that was the thing. And then, so we will then think about very carefully about, what are the table settings? What will people read? What are the different levels of visitors? We wanted to have that feeling that if someone's just passing by and looks, it should feel a bit like a painting. And then we wanted to have this feeling that if you walk up closer, you might spot some details and stuff. And then the third level of visitors taking time to walk through will start to unravel much more of the stories being told and hear a bit of sound or see the video, understand the view outside. So we often think about different types of visitors and their attention spans and in an installation context. And on the other hand, we obsess a lot over detail, and we obsess a lot over the credibility of our sources that enable us to tell this story. And I think it's really important for us that there is credible data and research that goes behind it. So that, I suppose, is the R&D part of the, like with our oak table, it's not just any oak tree that we made into a table, because we're talking about this revival and resurgence. So this is an oak tree that had lived for over 100 years and died in someone's garden, and they wanted to donate it or gift it, or basically they gifted us this dead yet beautiful oak tree. And so it took, because it was so dense and so full of knots, because it was so old, it was really hard to make into the table. But it is now, even after its death, it's holding everything together.
So beautiful. Oh, that's so special, even to unpack that. I have this amazing line from one of your talks or lectures where you say that you're looking to define or to drive hope that can inspire action. And the idea of hope translating into action is so powerful at this moment of time, where I almost feel like we have anxiety driving action. And to use this word hope, for me personally, more and more important to have people say, I would like to define myself as somebody who is an activist, and how you almost define for yourself, what is activism today in your own practice?
I studied documentary film, and as a filmmaker and a documentary filmmaker, it was a lot of live filming and a live sort of, you're on ground, you're following people, so I think there was a little bit of that in me, of kind of on the ground level of kind of understanding, listening to people, being witness to some really dark stuff as a documentary filmmaker. And so in general, that sense of, on one hand, the agency I had with the camera, but then the other hand, the realization that I really can't do, what can I do as such? And so I think it was part of it is to acknowledge that this is where my strengths lie. This is often for John similar, that this is where our strengths lie. But we feel over the last few years, especially with climate, that we're really quite screwed, frankly speaking, in where we're heading. And the more we've researched, the more we've read, we felt that even though there's data and there's evidence and there's models, it's not really the thing that is motivating and inspiring people to take action. And the more we've thought about it, it's really stories that hold us together, and stories that connect and bind us. And really, it feels like this is the time where we need to create and generate lots and lots of new myths, new stories about a different world, about different kinds of worlds. Having those stories and those worlds, so they act as beacons of hope. And then it becomes our collective efforts that help us navigate this crisis towards those beacons of hope. So So we need to plant those beacons. We need to say that it could be a world which is non-extractive, where we have a different relationship with our species, and it could form stories in terms of children's books and films and what have you, and infiltrate public imagination. Really, that would be, I suppose, where we feel our idea of activism comes in.
I think of that also on a personal level is just every time I've been paralyzed in my work, especially or generally, it's because I don't know what that next beacon is and where I need to get to. And the second it manifests, all of us know how to figure things out, how to hustle, how to work hard to get to a certain goal. But what's often the hardest part is to understand what that future might be, what you might actually want, where you might want to get to. Nothing is future facing. I was going to ask you to describe what is a futurist, and you've just unpacked that. That is a futurist. You envision a better future and you present that to people in different ways.
I would say so, yeah. I think not a traditional futurist in that sense, but yeah.
And so you're also a professor. So I'm really curious about, first of all, what you teach, because it's also extremely unusual and very cool, but also how you're navigating this time right now teaching.
Sure. Yeah, I teach on a course called Design Investigations at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. I think we frame the course as with roots in industrial design, because that's what the course used to be. My desire from the course is that graduates who leave are critical thinkers and doers. And so we leave people with the ability to ask good questions. So every project with the students is about what's the question you want to interrogate or investigate, and then start to develop their projects. Because even with Superflux, we think what we are really doing is designing questions. All our education systems are focused on children being able to give answers. I feel that kills imagination, and I feel with the university students, I want to bring back their ability to actually ask questions and become those critical thinkers. My conspiracy theory is that the reason our education system has been focused on answers rather than questions is we don't want people to become thinkers, and that would damage status quo. So that's why better to just have answers rather than questions.
I mean, but that's not even a conspiracy theory for a second. And secondly, that's how the whole world is set up. We are set up in every way to be told what to do. And why would they want space for societies which question that's inefficient for them in achieving their own means? And because my next question was actually going to be to you around your mentors and people who've guided you, and because I'm sure it's very diverse, and you mentioned Ron Arad, but those people who allowed you to not know and who maybe were able to pull you forward without telling you what to think.
Initially, my parents have been very kind of, my mom, I suppose my mom in many ways is a role model. She was born in Baroda, one amongst 5 girls. Girls were at that point not even supposed to get highly educated or anything. But, she was a strong-willed young lady who decided she wants to be a pilot. And so she was actually learning to fly, cycling like 8 miles at the age of 17 and going to this little airfield in Baroda. But then she decided that she's not going to do that and studied architecture instead.
I want to meet your mother now. I'm then so curious about you from documentary to design. But to your mummy, and so did she encourage you to go down this route of filmmaking?
No, they did not actually. That was a surprise to them. I went to design school and that I'll do textile design or communication design or something. And
it's
then
the most famous design school in India and in the subcontinent.
It's really great. It was a great school for me. I really, really appreciate the time I had there. But so I think a lot of it was, I was actually quite a shy student when I was there.
And were there as many men as women there at the time?
Yeah, less men actually, maybe. more women. I think the biggest thing is that my dad was a feminist in that sense of the word, in because his siblings, like my cousins, his brother's children, were not allowed to wear jeans or cut their hair or choose their own life partners. And me and my sister would do all of that. My dad would be told off by his brothers that how are you raising these girls? How can they be like, accepted in society and blah blah blah. And my dad says they are their own people. But in a way there was this inherent sense of it's okay. You can plow through, and it's not been easy. I just landed here in London and I didn't know anyone a day before my master's started at the Royal College of Art. It's not been easy to establish a practice. I've been in so many boardrooms where people think I'm an intern. I've gone for talks where people have said I shouldn't be in the speaker's room if I'm not a speaker. I have experienced so much like that kind of what you might call everyday racism and everyday sexism. That in a way, I don't talk about it. I don't want to make a fuss about it because it just makes me more determined. This is the world and I'm going to have to find a way to exist here. It's now a lot easier. It's not been so for a long time.
And it's easier because people like you have paved the fucking way and said, I'm going to stand here and think in ways that you could only dream of thinking. Thank you for sharing that. And so tell us like a little bit about, you went down this path of documentary design, but you guys are at the forefront of tech, design, art, and in the most interesting and thoughtful ways.
We did start our practice with technology, and has been our core focus, in a sense that the course that we were on at RCA was around tech. It was about thinking of technology in playful ways, but also thinking about the unintended consequences of living with these technologies. We've engaged with technology and continue to do so for quite a lot of clients. We've worked with Deepmind and Google, as well as like small firms, and recently about to release a film for an organization called Omidyar Network, thinking about ambient technologies. And actually, it's embedding ideas around racism and capitalism and extractivism so deeply embedded with the ideas around technology that that would be an interesting piece, very different from like the Venice piece, much more kind of activist stance with that one. But yeah, technology, we're really excited about new and emerging technologies, but we think of them really in a very material way. So we want to get our hands dirty. We want to understand the mechanisms that not just help create products from these technologies, but the relationships we form with these technologies, the levels of trust and mistrust, the kind of invisible systems that dictate our attention span, that dictate our interactions. It's everywhere. We are very much in the AI space right now because my students were working on projects around AI. We've done quite a lot of work thinking about AI. We've been exploring alternative narratives around AI. So there is a narrative which is around two narratives. One is it's amazing. It's just AI is amazing. It's going to be the future, or it's whatever. And then the other is like all our jobs are gone. It's taking away all our jobs. It's horrible. It's not good for us. So we are trying to explore a third narrative, which is the coexistence and collaborative path.
And so I'm excited to see that. So is it coming up? Like, is that last project, is it going to be a piece for Omidyar, or is it going to be sort of an ongoing collaboration with them?
For now, it's a piece we did with them. It was a big research piece, and one of the outcomes is a film with a series of speculative artifacts that we will release in September.
Okay, really exciting. If you can just tell us a little bit about what you did with Deepmind, and what that was, because I also think that's really interesting.
I would say that we explored alternative narratives around AI. We spent quite a lot of time understanding some of their research, talking to their researchers, learning about how challenging it is to actually make something that is that even has common sense, an AI agent that even has common sense, but really thinking about different ways and different approaches to consider this idea of artificial intelligence. So it was quite a broad piece. It was a lot of fun.
And also really powerful to think about this interdisciplinary conversation where you're going inside a world that, people view, I think, with, this fear and trepidation, and to be able to unpack new ways of thinking on both sides of a similar practice. Okay, so I could speak to you forever, and my last question is to put you on the spot. Is we do ask all of our open-ended guests to share with us a call to action for this moment, and maybe what is it that you care about literally in this moment of time? What matters, and what do you want people to care about?
Wow. I care about a lot of things, but I would say climate action is my top of my agenda. Is like a call to action to, for me, would be political leaders to really make the commitments rather than talking about them. We have COP26 coming up in Glasgow. Please don't let this be a wasted opportunity for everyone involved, not just political leaders, but corporate leaders. To let's do what we can to reduce the crises we are going to face. I can play my role, but I can't really make some big decisions. And anything we can do to help those decision makers make those decisions, I'm ready to make. If it means doing pro bono work, so be it. I'm just really interested. Like, I'm helping a Nigerian activist who started Fridays for Future in Nigeria to bring her vision of the Great Green Wall in the Lake Chad to life. Only because I think we need to give our time and resources to people who have visions of hope for the future.
Oh, that's beautiful. If you ever need an intern, literally, now you have my number. I'm here. I would love to work with you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Anab, for joining us. You're amazing. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We welcome you to join and continue the conversation over on our Instagram at openended_design. You can also find us on LinkedIn at openended design and our website www.openended-design.org.